I've noticed a certain little sketchbook going around the art community. So I thought I'd review it. A lot of you already guessed that it was the ILLO sketchbook, but let's just pretend it was a surprise. Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Hope you're doing well. Want to address a couple of things before I actually get started with this. One, because the entire world is on lockdown right now, my hair looks like trash because I can't get a haircut, so my hood will stay on for the entire video. Second, there's going to be a different setup. You can see that, but I mean, like, in the video itself, when you're watching me draw, there's going to be a change in setup. During the first drawing, you will see me film in my regular setup, but then after the first drawing, you will see me drawing on this desk. So anyway, ILLO sketchbooks, am I right? I have seen so many people start using this sketchbook, and I'm very confused as to why. I wanted to just figure out what all the hype was about, because there are artists that I follow that use these sketchbooks repeatedly. I'll just be on YouTube watching a bunch of sketchbook tours, as you do, and these keep popping up. I just realized my glasses are wet. Yeah, I haven't figured out a setup for my face cam, so I'm just sitting in front of a window, which is probably why this isn't the best face cam I filmed, but it's fine, everything's a process. I've seen many people say that they want this sketchbook, they seem desperate for this sketchbook, and I don't understand why, and there's a person walking. I'm filming directly in front of my window. Okay, we're good. I am not particularly picky with my sketchbooks, you could say. I just kind of either get a sketchbook or make a sketchbook, and then I just make do. I don't normally use the same sketchbook repeatedly unless I really like a sketchbook. It's also a little bit on the pricey end for a sketchbook, so if I'm being honest, if I wasn't planning on making this video, I probably would not have bought it. So I'm going to go really hard on the sketchbook. I got a bunch of supplies that I use very often, some supplies that I don't use as often but I think should mention, and then also just some miscellaneous supplies, which is mostly sketching stuff. I'm not gonna pull any punches. I'm going to really be I'm gonna be cracking down on this sketchbook. I don't know what I'm trying to say. I'm going to be very honest. Also, this isn't sponsored. It's not sponsored. They did not send this to me. I bought this with my own money. I bought mine on Amazon, so it was a little bit cheaper, but I did buy it through the ILLO company through Amazon, so I don't know why it was cheaper, but it was. But I'm going to be going through each supply that I tested in this sketchbook, and I will let you know what I thought about each supply, its goods, its bads, and let's just get into it because I'm rambling again, and you guys hate that, and I don't know what else to say. Okay, jumping right into it, I'm going to be starting with pencil sketches. When I first felt the paper, it was really thick, it was really smooth, and I liked that. That's typically the paper that I prefer to work with, and it gave me a good idea about what would work in this sketchbook. I was really excited to work with some supplies, less excited to work with others, but another thing that I really appreciated about the paper is that it was a pure white. It wasn't an off-white, it wasn't a cream color, it wasn't a gray color, it was pure white, and again, I personally really like that in my paper. I don't have anything spectacular to say about this sketchbook in terms of sketching in pencil. It was pretty just There's no really big complaints. I feel like the pencil smudges a little bit easier in this sketchbook, and I think that is because the texture is very smooth, and for pencil sketches you typically want something at least a little bit more textured. But as someone who only really sketches in pencil, if I'm going to be inking it and erasing the pencil later anyways, it wasn't really a big issue for me. I'm happy with how the pencil worked in this sketchbook. It's, again, not anything spectacular, but if you don't use pencil sketches a lot, this sketchbook does the job just fine. Another thing about this sketchbook that I don't really know where else to mention, so I guess I'll just mention it here. The pages are somewhat see-through. Like, it's not super jarring, but if you are focusing on a specific drawing and you're focusing on a particular part of the page and you have a drawing on the backside, it can be a little annoying, to say the least, especially if you're someone like me and you film YouTube videos. I just really don't want any of those drawings distracting you guys while I'm filming, so if they do, I'm sorry. I'm surprised that this happened considering how thick the paper is, but I think it probably has something to do with the fact that the paper is pure white. If the paper is a different tone, like if it's a cream color or an off-white, the ghosting of the pages underneath can kind of just blend in with the color of the page, and it's not really that noticeable, but it's a little bit of a nitpicky thing, but I thought I'd mention it here. Again, I'm not pulling any punches with the sketchbook. Moving on to working with line art, I used my Micron pens for the line art, and I am very happy with how this sketchbook uses ink. I've been enjoying using line art a lot in the sketchbook, actually. It's kind of the ideal paper for line art, and that made me really happy. This was one of the things that I was really excited about. It goes down so smooth, it does not smudge, it's beautiful, it doesn't bleed. I have yet to use an inking pen or any other pen that bleeds through onto the other side. Like I said, there is slight ghosting, but that's usually more with darker colors. I will get into that later. Again, with the ghosting, it's not something that usually bothers me, but again, the only reason it really does bother me is because of filming. But it's, again, something that you should keep in mind. When you use inks in the sketchbook, that is when the ghosting is made a lot more obvious. Otherwise, you wouldn't really notice that. To finish off this first illustration, I'm going to be testing how markers work in the sketchbook, specifically Copic markers. This was the first thing that I wanted to test out because it is by far the supplies that I use the most when it comes to traditional art. So it was really important to me to figure out how these markers work, and I've heard very good things about how markers work in the sketchbook, so I was definitely, I had my hopes up more than I think I should have. So using Copics in this was a little bit of a mixed bag. It was something, I can say that. The first thing I noticed right away is that it felt like it sucked a lot of ink out of my marker. And even for markers that were like nice and juicy and fresh, I shouldn't have said that, I'm sorry. But even for markers that do have a lot of ink in it, it still felt like to get that, it was just sucking a lot of ink out of my marker, and I didn't appreciate that these markers aren't cheap and refills are expensive. I used a lot of layering and I used a lot of blending, and they seemed to work pretty well. It was pretty easy to layer, it was pretty easy to blend, just again, it felt like I was using a lot more ink than usual. Once I started really getting into the illustration, I started to notice these little white specks on the paper, and it's not the biggest of deals. It seems to be more noticeable in some areas than others. For example, I'm looking at the drawing right now as I'm recording this audio, and in his hair, there isn't really any white specks, but then on his shirt, there are a lot of white specks, and it's very inconsistent. It's kind of hard to figure out why that happened, especially if it happened in some parts of the page and not other parts of the page. I don't know why that is. It should either be all throughout the page or not there, but it's very inconsistent, it's very unpredictable, and that is the biggest fault of this paper in terms of marker. The texture isn't necessarily a bad thing, it just really depends on what you're going for. I personally don't really care about it. It's not something that I'm striving for, it's not something that I hate when it happens, but it is something that I really don't like about the sketchbook just because it's so inconsistent. Because if the white specks were there, then at least I would know what to expect when I'm drawing it. But whenever I'm working with markers in the sketchbook, I just really do not know what's going to happen, and that is why it was such a mixed experience. I would have praised this paper a lot more for markers if it hadn't been for that. Now I'm coming to the part of the markers that you guys are all waiting for. You guys want to know, do the markers bleed? Now of course the Copic markers bled through onto the opposite side of the page. That's not something I'm going to fault this sketchbook for. That is something that happens with pretty much every single sketchbook out there. The big bleed test for me is if it bleeds onto the page underneath. And so if we flip the page, oh look at that, it bled. To be fair, I do have a lot of layering and blending in my art style, like I said. I also use Copics later on in this sketchbook, and even just a little bit of layering, it bleeds through. If you're doing one very quick patchy layer, it's fine, and it doesn't bleed onto the next page, but you don't really want that, so it definitely bleeds onto the page underneath. So I would recommend, if you are using the sketchbook and you are using markers in it regularly, keep a scrap paper in the back pocket, so then that way whenever you use markers you can take it out and put it on so you don't ruin the page underneath. The next supply that I wanted to test out was gouache paints, because I am using gouache paints more and more as the days go on. And normally I would use binder clips to hold my pages down to prevent buckling, because most sketchbooks aren't made to handle watercolors really. And so I was kind of expecting these pages to buckle, but I wanted to see how much it would buckle. So for this drawing, I didn't use any binder clips, and for the next drawing, which is the watercolor one. Also, don't mention the fact that I'm using gouache and I inked this first, because with gouache you're not supposed to do that. I was just getting really into this drawing and I loved it, so pretend that I didn't ink it before I painted. After I had painted the first image on this page, so the gouache painting, I was pleasantly surprised with the buckling. It did not buckle as much as I was expecting it to. I think that is because the paper is thick, and even though with the paints you typically want something a little more textured, I think that the fact that these pages are a little bit thicker kind of makes up for it. which makes it not awful to use paints in. Honestly, there's not anything super spectacular to say about it, just like the pencils. It's okay. I feel like the paper started to not like the paints after I put down a couple of layers. Again, if you have a more simplistic art style, this might not be an issue for you, but when it comes to something like gouache, you really do need several layers. You start off with a more watered down layer, and then you get to the thicker layers as you go on top. So something that I noticed about the gouache is that it liked to handle the thicker gouache more than the watered down gouache. Paints like acrylic paint, and then when you don't water down your gouache, it more of just sits on top of the paper, whereas with watercolor and more watered down gouache, the colors seep into the paper and they soak in. I don't know why that was so hard for me to think of, but can we please get enough in the chat? It's so sad. Basically, this paper likes paints that sit on top rather than sink in. So if you're going to be using gouache in a sketchbook, I'd recommend not watering it down too much. Again, it's just okay. It's nothing spectacular, nothing that made me go, wow, this was worth the almost $17 for this sketchbook. But it's okay, we still have plenty of art supplies to go through. I'm sure I'll find something that I absolutely love, aside from inks. Maybe, hopefully, fingers crossed. I say that like I don't know. I know. You guys just don't. Next to the gouache, I of course had to do watercolors, and again, I was pleasantly surprised with how little buckling this paper did. I was expecting it to completely warp and bend out of shape. But there wasn't really any of that. Obviously, there was some warping, and I'm sure if I had used binder clips, it wouldn't have even warped this much, but I'm pleasantly surprised. I'm really bad with my watercolor paper, so I always get hot press and cold press mixed up, so I'm not going to label anything. I'm just gonna say, between hot press and cold press watercolor paper, one is more textured than the other. Now, I do prefer the more textured one. That's just the type of look that I like for my watercolor illustrations, but there is watercolor paper that is more smooth. So I guess this paper can be a little bit more reminiscent of that, but again, it's still not made for watercolor, so it wasn't the best experience either way. Also, I was originally going to have a section dedicated to India ink and ink wash, but then after filming that, it was pretty much the same as watercolor. So I'll throw some of the footage up here. The India ink was very similar to the microns, and then the ink wash was very similar to watercolors. So there's literally nothing else to say about it other than that. Something that I noticed throughout all of the different paints that I used is that you can't lift the paints very well. With watercolors, normally what you can do is if you mess up, you can wet the area that you messed up and then get like a paper towel or a rag or something and then dab on it and then it'll lift the paint. And I normally use that for when I mess up because I'm really bad at coloring inside the lines and I splatter paint everywhere. It's not a good time. And so I will use this to try and clean up my drawings a little bit more. But this didn't really like that. Similar to the layering issue. First off, watercolors have the same layering issue. Second of all, if you try and lift, it just starts to tear away at the paper a little bit. I think the sketchbook just is not made for my art style because I love to layer, I love to blend. That's the part of art that I really enjoy when it comes to coloring, and so the fact that this sketchbook cannot handle that is just a little bit disappointing. So I had very low expectations for using watercolor, so that being said, I'm very happy with the results. It wasn't the worst experience like I thought it would be. I enjoyed myself. I like the drawing, but again, not anything spectacular. It's not made for watercolors, so that being said, it's not going to be anything spectacular, but the sketchbook is advertised as being able to handle a variety of materials, and while it can handle it, it's not ideal, if that makes any sense. So far, I'm like an angry father with this ILLO sketchbook, but also like an angry father. Maybe my expectations were just a little too high. I don't know what this... I'm just gonna move on. But yes, it's summary. It's very similar to gouache, not the best, but it does the job. Next up is acrylic paints to finish off the paints for the most part. Again, we'll talk about it later. Now, I'm not an expert in acrylic paints, but I will say I use them often enough to give some sort of an input, and it's, again, okay. Nothing spectacular. It's just eh. Now, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think acrylic paint is really meant for most papers. It's mostly made for like canvases and stuff like that. You can use it on paper, obviously, because I did that, but I don't think most sketchbooks account for acrylic paint for sketchbooks. But again, it's okay. The paper really didn't warp at all. Again, I think it's because it's thick, and it was as average as an experience can get. I feel like it was a little bit harder on this paper to get flat layers of color. I don't know if it was just me, because again, I'm not the best at acrylic paints, and this might be the shortest section in this whole video, because again, there's literally not much to say. It was the most average experience I could have had with acrylic paints. I blended okay, layered okay, hard to get flat colors, but overall fine, slight warping, but not too much. The most average it can get. There we go. There's my Aspen. There we go. There's the paints. Moving on. The next thing I wanted to test was a colored pencil, and I was a little uneasy to test colored pencil after figuring out how regular pencil works for sketching, and oh boy, it was rough. I did not have a good time making this illustration. It was not good, I'm gonna be honest. Up until this point, I really liked inks. The markers were pretty okay. I liked them. Aside from inks, I think it handled markers the best. And then all of the paints were very mediocre. This one, though, oh man, it was real bad. I did not like it at all. So if you are a person who works exclusively in colored pencil or someone who works with colored pencil often, do not buy this sketchbook. I'm just gonna straight up say that. Don't do it. You will be cursing yourself. It was awful. Like I was saying before, you typically want something more textured when it comes to pencil, and this one was very smooth, so it didn't go well. I feel like, again, the pencil smeared so much easier than normal, and I don't normally have an issue with colored pencil and smearing. Like, obviously it smears a little bit, but it's not something that, normally when I use colored pencils, they don't smear this much, so it was a bad time. I feel like whenever I would put a color down, it just wasn't as vibrant as a color would normally be, and that was a big letdown. Part about colored pencils that I really like is that they can get very bright and vibrant, but these ones just straight up weren't. I could not blend well, I could not layer well. It was a mess. It was a really rough time. Before I filmed the footage that you're seeing now, I actually did a colored pencil illustration later on in the sketchbook, and let me just say, it made me really upset to film this part of the video. I was putting it off for so long just because I was not happy about what was to come. But yeah, if you use colored pencils often, do not recommend. The only time I usually use colored pencils is for sketching, which I'm probably not going to do a lot in the sketchbook, and then for adding final touches on other illustrations. So I'm going to be doing that. I am not going to be sketching in colored pencil because it was a disaster. Do not recommend for colored pencils. 0 out of 10. Last section is the miscellaneous section. These are things that I just wanted to test out for funsies, but I didn't know where else to put them, so they're here. I'm going to be going through these at rapid fire pace. I'm not going to dwell on any one supply often, so let's just get to it. Water-based markers. To test this, I used my Tumblr brush markers, and very mediocre once again. It doesn't bleed onto the next page. It doesn't even bleed onto the back of the page. There's slight ghosting for darker colors, so be careful of that. It's hard to get even layers, although I feel like that's pretty standard for water-based markers. Ballpoint pen, again, very mediocre. I like sketching on smooth, thick paper like I said, and so I really enjoyed sketching in ballpoint pen. If it's any of the mediocre supplies that are a little bit higher than mediocre, I would say it's the ballpoint pen. I really enjoyed sketching in it. I'm probably going to make all of my sketches in ballpoint pen, unless it's a finished illustration, of course. Crayons, because fuck it. Posca pens, not good. To be fair, Posca pens aren't really made for drawing on paper, so I'm not really going to fault the sketchbook for that, but since I do like making Posca pen illustrations, I thought it'd be good to mention here. It's hard to layer them. You have to really, really let them sit in order for you to layer on them, and they don't go down smoothly. You have to do a couple of layers, otherwise they're a little bit not transparent, but streaky. And if you work on it too much, you get those little clumps of paint / fuzziness from the nib. I wouldn't recommend using Posca pens often in this sketchbook. Felt tip pens. They went down very smooth, no complaints. There's very slight ghosting with darker colors, as usual. No bleeding. Again, very mediocre. This is another supplies that I think I'm going to be sketching in often, but there's nothing spectacular to say. Sharpie, the last thing I'm going to be talking about. It bled. It bled pretty bad. It didn't bleed onto the page underneath though, so that's something that's different from the Copic markers. I don't understand why, because normally those two work pretty similarly in terms of bleeding, but I also noticed that the Sharpie pen feathered out a little bit more than the Copic markers, and again, I'm not quite sure why. I think it's just the different qualities of ink. So, overall thoughts on this sketchbook. I still don't understand the hype. It's a nice sketchbook. I am planning on making this my official sketchbook 16. I do like it. The paper is nice. but I don't understand the hype. I really don't. So currently, as of filming this on the ILLO website, this is the 8x8, and the 8x8 is listed as, I have my notes, $16.75, and then the 10x10 is listed as $25, which to me is a lot of money, especially the 10x10. I think if you do want to get these, then I would suggest the 8x8. You can also buy them in packs. I don't believe the 10x10 is available in any packs. For the 8x8, you can buy a 3-pack and a 5-pack, which are $30 and $75 respectively. So if you do really like these sketchbooks and you want to use them, it would be cheaper to buy them in the packs. But again, I don't understand why, because with the way that this sketchbook is spoken about, I was expecting it to be like super high quality, top tier sketchbook, but if I'm being completely honest, I've used sketchbooks that are cheaper than this that I've enjoyed working in more. It could just be my personal preference, and if this is your favorite sketchbook, I don't want you to think that I'm shitting on it because it is a nice sketchbook. I just personally think it's a little bit overpriced for what it actually does and what it promises to do. So on the ILLO website, it says that this sketchbook is supposed to be a versatile, all-around good quality sketchbook for a fair price, which first of all, I don't normally spend almost $17 on a single sketchbook. And again, I feel like I've used sketchbooks that are in the $5 to $10 price range that I've enjoyed working in much more than I've enjoyed working in this one. I think my favorite parts about the sketchbook is the size. I really like the square dimension. I think it's a really nice dimension. I also like the cover. I like the texture. It's like faux leather. I don't believe it's real leather, but it's like a faux leather. There's a ribbon, there's an elastic, and then in the back there is a pocket. Those are all features in a sketchbook that I like. If you've used an ILLO sketchbook before and you've had a different experience, let me know. I would love to hear your experience. Obviously, since filming the drawings in this video, I have worked in the sketchbook more, and I did say I was planning on completing it. I would say it's not a bad experience. It was just an underwhelming experience, especially for how much the sketchbook is hyped up. But if you found this helpful, let me know. Let me know if you still have any different thoughts or similar thoughts on the ILLO sketchbook. Let's just start a conversation about this little guy. And if you are new to this channel, consider subscribing. This is my first real review video, I believe, at least for an art supply, so let me know if you'd like to see more of this, and feel free to suggest any other art supplies. Since I am spending my own money on these things, the reviews might not be as often as you guys would like, and I'm sorry about that, but I am open to reviewing some products that you are suggesting. But I also make a lot of illustration stuff. All of the drawings in here were of my OCs, so if you like seeing people's original characters, you can subscribe because I draw a lot of my characters. And you can also follow me on social media. They will be on screen now and linked in the description box below. You can follow me on Instagram. That is where I post my art and I'm most active. I talk about videos, interact with you guys a lot more, so if you have an Instagram, go follow me over there, but if not, it's no big deal. And there will also be some videos on screen now and linked in the iCard for you to check out. iCard, wherever it is. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week. Bye. I had to burp.